This is part 3 of beginner watercolor exercises where I want to help you build confidence. In this video, we will learn about the wet on wet technique. Hi there, I'm Audrey, your watercolor bestie, and welcome to my studio. If you like this video and want to start your own watercolor journey, I have a free course, Watercolor Basics for the Absolute Beginner. You can sign up using the link in the description below. One of the main frustrations with watercolor is controlling the water. And today's beginner exercise will really teach you how to control the water. Before we get started, let's discuss our supplies. I'm going to be using the LUKAS 1862 watercolors from Jerry's Artarama. I love the LUKAS brand because they're artist grade quality, super rich and creamy in color, but they're student grade prices. So quite affordable for how much paint you're getting. I'm going to use the round shape for most of these demonstrations and the size 6, 3, and 2. For paper, I'm using the Canson brand cold pressed 140 pound, and I've cut them into small sheets like this. Then I also have a jar of water, a spray bottle, and a paper towel to help blot my brush. The wet on wet technique simply means that we will be applying a wet brush, whether that's with water or with paint, onto a wet surface, whether that means a wet clean paper or wet painted paper. As we've seen in part 2, a lot of things can happen when there's excess water or when we introduce extra water or paint into a wet area, because you're going to see those bleeds and blooms. So make sure to review that video before moving on with this one. Now, the wet on wet technique can be frustrating for some people because of the lack of control. So that's what I want to focus on in this video, how to really control the water and paint when you do this technique. First, let's discuss a little bit of the science of what's happening. And I put that in air quotes because I'm not a scientist, so I'm just going to be explaining it in very generic terms. So when you add water to a dry paper, there is a clear boundary. And when you add paint into that droplet of water, the paint is not going to go outside of that boundary. Now, when you add water to a wet paper, the water is going to flow to the lowest point of the paper surface to try to keep things even. Basically, wet paint is going to go wherever it's wet. The tricky part is knowing how wet your brush is and how wet your paper is. But that's the basic knowledge of how water and paint will move. So how do we know how wet our paper is? Well, Bruce McAvoy on his website describes 6 stages of paper wetness. The first is completely wet. It's super shiny, it's like a mirror-like surface, and you might see beads or blobs of water. The second level is glossy. You see a wet, shiny surface, but you can still see the texture of the paper, and this is more prominent with cold pressed paper versus hot pressed. The third is satins. So you can see the shine still, but it's only in the sunken hollows of the paper texture. The fourth is moist/humid, so it's just damp to the touch. 5 is matte/damp. It looks and feels dry, but the lowest layer of the paper might still be a little bit damp. And then the 6th stage is completely dry. So I already tested some of these out, and I want you to try to do that on your own as well. But I tested them on different sheets, and then I also varied the wetness of my brush. So this first test was just kind of me just getting used to, knowing how wet my paper was. Yeah, but you can already see here, I took some notes. So when the paper was completely wet and then you add in paint, there's really quick dispersion and it takes a super long time to dry. And then so it disperses less and less. And you can see the little dispersion happening up here at the top. And the dispersion is happening less and less. And obviously when the paper is completely dry, you don't get any dispersion. So this was my first test. And then I did it again. And this time I did it in a shape so that you can kind of see, where the paint is dispersing. And so this one, I used a semi-wet brush. So meaning that, I blotted the brush just a little bit before applying that wet brush onto the paper. So here's the first stage completely wet, and you can sort of make out that shape of the S, right? But there's heavy dispersion of the pigment. And as you continue, again, less and less dispersion, And then what's interesting about the dry one is that the color is still very bright because it's not being dispersed in the wet area. So the paint pigments are kind of like sticking together. And then I did yet another test. So I, again, put down the 6 stages of paper wetness, and then I did the test again with a wet brush, but this time I used a pretty wet brush. And so with this test, you can see that I could barely make out the shape of the S because the wet paint plus the wet paper just, made the pigments go everywhere. And again, you can still barely tell what these letters are until you get to the matte stage, or even the moist, you can still, kind of make out the S. And then with the dry, again, you can clearly see what that is. So the key to the wet on wet is obviously knowing how wet your paper is. And so you can do your own test with the 6 stages of paper wetness, but also knowing how wet your brush is. So making sure that if you don't want a very wet brush, just take that paper towel or cotton rag or whatever you have and just lightly, just quickly blot. You don't have to blot for very long because then you're going to be taking out all the other moisture, but just blot for a little bit and you'll remove that excess moisture. I hope these tests help you in figuring out the effect you want to have when you paint. I think when I do the wet on wet technique, I use mostly the satin or the moist level of wetness, and maybe sometimes even matte, just because maybe I forgot it was wet and then it just kind of spontaneously happens. And I kind of stay in that range because I just still want to maintain some sort of control over where the paint goes. Now, if you're doing a wash, which we'll talk about more in another video, then you're just filling in a shape, right? So you can move that paint around in the wet area. But if you're trying to paint like a saturated line with little dispersion, then you really want to make sure that your paint is, either moist or matte level of wetness. And then you really want to make sure that your brush is not wet at all. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new about the wet on wet technique. Remember, do a couple of different tests where you just practice even just wetting the paper. I think that's really important because sometimes we think that it's, satin or low gloss, but it might actually still be very wet, right? Or we think that it's dry, but it's actually matte. So even just being comfortable with the levels of wetness paper or the paper wetness is going to help you be a better watercolorist. And then as you add paint and then you watch it disperse really quickly or, whatever happens, just try to learn from it, right? Watercolor is really about literally going with the flow. So if something unexpected happens, don't freak out. I know it's so hard, but don't freak out, but try to observe what's happening and then take notes. There are more parts to this watercolor beginner exercise series, and I do have that class, Watercolor Basics, for the absolute beginner. So if you like this video, please hit that thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment down below and share about your experience with the wet on wet technique. Thanks for watching. Happy painting.